What's up, guys? Lucas Burnley here with my co host, TJ Schwarz. You are listening to the Edge and Flow podcast after a little bit of a manic hiatus due to
Right.
travel and hunting and shows and life.
Yeah.
How you doing, TJ?
Oh, I'm doing good. I gotta apologize because I would normally think we'd want to give you a heads up that we had a gap or a break coming, and I would normally think to do that, but then we kind of got into the mix of a season of just a lot of things happening that kind of actually physically removed us from the ability to record because one of us wouldn't be at our home shop, which is where our setup is. So
Yeah, this has
um,
been a little bit of a stretch, but super excited to be back. And we've got a topic today that you and I spent a whole bunch of time kind of digging into when we were at Blade Show, um, which I think even though you and I haven't talked a whole lot over the last couple of weeks, I think both of us have been kind of chewing on this.
mhm.
The concept is the process is the product, right? And this is
Yeah.
something that you brought up while we were walking around Blade Show. Do you want to kind of just dig into it and give like a brief overview?
Yeah. So the process is the product is the phrase that I kind of came up with after a fashion. It's something that I think that's kind of guided me for years now, but I couldn't figure out how to describe it. But I had a sense of like what I was trying to do, but not a good phrasing for what that goal was. But the product or the process is the product. What that means is the it's easy to look at a knife or a watch or anything, a hat, a shirt, and say that's the product. That's what I'm interested in, and that's what I'm trying to sell. But I think it's functional and beneficial to think about the process which is used to make these products is actually the product, and the thing that you're selling, be it a knife or whatever, is kind of a extension of the process. So it's in a sense when someone buys something from you, they're buying a piece of your process, and what that is a little bit less relevant than the process itself. And it kind of at first glance sounds almost just like a semantic argument, like why does that actually
Totally.
make any difference, functionally? But because it has made such a difference for me, I really hope that we can explain like what that changes in terms of your approach when you start to look at the process as the product. And so right out the gate, the first example that I when I first realized this and it clicked, but I again didn't have the phrasing for it, was if you've seen, I did a folding comb some time back.
I remember that.
And the genesis of that was kind of interesting because basically I was in the knife industry already. I was designing knives for companies, and I made a few knives, and I just didn't have like, I could tell immediately the way I was making knives out of drill press and a grinder that I wasn't going to make a real business with the tools that I had without doing something a little bit different. And I kind of stalled on making knives because I didn't own a robust enough process in making knives for it to be a functional business model.
Right. And
Um,
your head is so firmly kind of in production, scalable
yeah,
processes and growth that I think that one explanation of this concept right out of the gate is that this relates primarily to the idea of business,
yeah,
like in this concept,
exactly.
right? Like sure, you can look at any product, not care about the process that brought that to market,
Hmm.
but if you are looking at your own business as the end product, that's where I think this concept
Hmm.
really comes
Yeah,
into
it's
play.
it's a business strategy, is what it
Total
is.
strategy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the comb, what happened there is I was living in an apartment. I had my grinder in another shop that I was like kind of borrowing space from, my knife making equipment, and I realized I was like, okay, I want to make a product. What can I make, and it be a real business venture right now? It's not knives because I don't own a CNC. I don't really have the resources to do that. I don't have the ability to do a bevel efficiently and effectively. And I thought, okay, well, my what processes do I have available to me? And that was, my dad's a leather worker. He has a hydraulic clicker press, which can cut leather really fast, like any shape of leather. And, you order the clicker die, it's go time on whatever shape. And so I'm like, well, I've got that. I don't know what that product is alone. It's hard to say. But I also know a guy that in Boise who has a fiber laser that's, $700,000 insane fiber laser, super inexpensive, affordable cutting. And there was that. And then what I didn't have was like a way to do the blades of a knife. But I was like, well, a comb eliminates the features of a knife that are the parts that I don't have the ability to do right now effectively. And so what it was really is me looking at the processes that I have access to and then thinking, what is that product? What is the product that is resultant of those processes that I already have? And so I was able to immediately make like hundreds, and I sold thousands of combs over a period of time that ended up being like a huge percentage of my ability to just live at the time. Like it was the biggest part of my business for a while. And it only occurred that way because, like I said, I took the processes that were in front of me that were efficient and that I had control over and figured out what product those processes were. And that is, I think, the takeaway is like the process that you already have or that you have access to. Let's say you know someone who has this machine or you have the machine. That is the product. And you're trying to figure out how to sell that product. And the design of the end thing that the user buys is subsequent to the process. And the
Right.
process is what you're trying to sell.
Right. Well,
Um,
and I look at it in addition as a method of testing product viability. And coming
mhm,
from the handmade side, this is like a really sticky area, right? Because I'm used to like when I was learning, I was developing my skills and I was building a product. So my finished product was my hand labor.
mhm,
That's handmade, right? That's like the beauty of that process.
mhm.
The problem with that from a business standpoint is it's not scalable, right?
Right.
And like this really does get into semantics a little bit because obviously you can scale a handmade product, right?
Mhm,
But where I'm at now, this is a much more relevant kind of topic than it would have been 10 years ago. Because essentially, a lot of the way that I feel like I have been looking at things that I make is as the end product
mhm.
and not actually caring as much about the efficiency of the processes that are going into it. When we started to talk about that, I realized I was like, oh, the concept that the process is the product kind of relates to consistency, right?
Mhm.
For me, consistency is one of like the most important components of a successful business, right? Like you can do anything well once, and unless it's like picking up the right lottery ticket, like it's just not going to
Mhm.
stick.
Yeah.
It's the processes and the methods that you can do repeatably and consistently that really I think lead to a certain type of success.
Yeah.
So for me, I've just been running like all of these kind of concepts, preconceived concepts of business, craft, making through this filter, and it's been super interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
and you touched on a point of like thinking of it as the process is the product also relates to quality. So it's not just like an economics question because your
100%.
product is only as perfect as your process.
Right.
And if you could have an imperfect process that gives you a good product, but it's not going to be scalable. But if you have a perfect process or near perfect, it's kind of like perfect practice makes perfect, like the
Right.
sports phrase. Like if you have a repeatable, reliable process that produces good quality, then the product will then be successful because of that.
Right.
And so if you're overly focused on the knife and not the process, then the overall ceiling for you is a lot lower on that business side and on the
Right.
quality side. You know what
Right.
I mean?
Well, and I think this plays into a couple areas too, because you're able to shift it from okay, if we use your manufacturing process currently, as the process. Okay. The what you've developed in terms of producing a fixed blade knife with a sheath inside your shop, that is in a way the product, right? Because you're able to change out what the model is, but the process that you developed and the efficiency there allows you to go into the next knife having like a really, really clear and definable kind of trajectory and goal.
Yeah. And
Okay.
in a sense, you're selling the same process over again.
Right.
You're selling the same product over again,
Right.
but you change the design, you change the application, you change the net use to like the end user, which is a functional value. It's not like you're trying to do smoke and mirrors.
Right.
And that you're serving the customer by giving them multiple knife options, but you're repackaging the same product, which is the same process, right?
Right. Right.
And so if you have the process to sell, then the second part of the product is easier, right? Like the
Right.
knife itself. That the part of designing it and then executing becomes the smooth part that usually is the hard part if you have it backwards, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Right. Well,
Um,
and this is an interesting process as it relates to, I think, manufacturing, because we might be taking for granted the idea like there is some, trying to think how to like phrase this. I think there are instances where developing the process with the product eliminates being overly efficient with a product that doesn't have a market.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So you're in kind of a unique position because you had visibility around your name and your work. So out of the gate, efficiency was actually really important. Now,
Mhm.
not to say that starting a product efficiently is like ever a bad idea, but you might actually find it like, oh, well, I'm making more of this thing than I can sell,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
From a manufacturing standpoint. Another area that I'm kind of running through a filter with this is basic like so say you take an evergreen product like a say like a morale patch or something, right?
Mhm.
So you go through the process, you design the patch, you release the patch. Your process of bringing that to market, your timeline, your cost, the way you release it,
And your
that's
OEM.
what I'm starting to kind of see as like, oh, that becomes the product. Even if it's an
Yeah.
internal like understanding of what we think of as the finished product, which is a patch,
Mhm.
it's like it basically starts on a calendar.
Mhm.
So the process of taking it from calendar to production internally becomes like the repeatable, consistent manufacturable component.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's kind of heady. Like I
Let
get
me
it, but
let me give you an example that I think is a great way to kind of bring this into perspective and make it a little less abstract. So, if you're an OEM, let's say you bought two Haas CNC machines, put it in a shop, and you're going to be a job shop, right? Let's say now you're shopping out for guys that are trying to get OEM work done. So, a guy comes to you that wants handlebar mounts for a BMX bike, and he wants you to machine out of aluminum. What are you selling him? You're selling him a process. And this is clear, right? That your product as that job shop is the process of machining that handlebar mount. And that's really easy to understand because it's like an OEM or job shop, they're selling processes to people that need processes. So the process is the product. If you decided to sell your own handlebar mounts for BMX bikes, now you're selling directly to the customer, but the process is still the product. Just because you're the one selling it to the customer, not a middleman, doesn't change the fact that the process was always the product.
right.
You know what I mean? So it's like it's easy to think when you're the one doing, like if you're We Knife or Riot and you're doing an OEM project, it's super clear to see, oh, my process of making the knife is the product that they're buying.
Right.
But once you sell to customers, I think your brain starts to flip, and I don't think it should. Is the point I'm making, that like it should always be that process is the product. And again, it becomes a little bit of a thought that, like, we're talking semantics, but I think we can dive into a number of reasons why it does make a difference in, like, in how you function. And
I think as it relates to us, I think there's a lot of industries that this might feel like just a given, right? It kind of
mhm,
relates to efficiency. Like, you have to be process minded. Like, this is why there's process engineers, like all this stuff. We're talking about this, I think, in relation to kind of the sole entrepreneurial maker business, right? Which is, we are wearing many, many hats,
mhm,
and we don't always run things in the most efficient way. We don't always have the tribal knowledge of a business to be like, yeah, this is the way we do it. This is how we cost. This is how we,
mhm,
are projecting. So I also, and I also think it matters where you are coming into the industry. I think for the guys that are coming in from the handmade side, this is a really interesting concept, right?
mhm,
Because even if you are like making a knife fully by hand, right,
mhm,
or any product. So say I'm making a knife by hand. Okay, what is my process? Okay, well, my process is going to be, I start with a rough sketch. Okay, I finalize my sketch. I take that sketch and maybe I make a Lexan template. That Lexan template is going to allow me to maybe I make one first prototype. I like that prototype. The Lexan I use to make a hardened steel drill template.
mhm,
Okay. From that point forward, I say, okay, I'm going to make a batch of 12 knives based on that steel pattern.
mhm,
That workflow then just repeats. That's your process. Okay.
mhm,
That happens and it goes into any product that I do.
mhm,
The extension of that is to say, okay, well, that's my first 12 process. After those 12 knives, that blank is going to be used for CAD to go to waterjet.
mhm.
Now the waterjet gets integrated into moving forward. And I just think it's a way of looking at your process constantly to not just be okay with, well, this is the way that I make things. It's kind of like a roadmap that you're able to use just to say, well, okay, this works at 12, but what if I want to do 100?
Mhm.
Okay, does 100 work if you want to do 500?
Right.
It's a really interesting scaling tool,
Yeah.
because I think a lot of times people look at the end product and it just stops.
Mhm.
It's a knife.
Yeah.
This is how
And
I
then
make it.
and then you try to back into it of, like, this is what I wanna make. I'm just gonna, by any means necessary, make it.
Right,
And so the focus is entirely on the knife,
right,
not on the process. It's like you back into the end product rather
right,
than creating the process, and then that leads you to your products, to your
right.
saleable products.
Well, here's an example of, I think, where I'm finding this most relevant for myself. I have always used CAD and CNC to get me to the point where I could make a knife, but the knife was always the focus.
Mhm.
Over the last, I don't know, like year, especially when you and I kind of started doing some of the tutoring around CAD, um, I started to realize, like, oh, my CAD process is really affecting my end result, and there's an inefficiency in there. And so
Mhm.
the way that I've been looking at it lately is like, that is actually one of the most critical components of my product, because if I'm able to focus more on developing my skills around CAD and machining, it shortens almost every timeline during the design of the product, as well as like the finishing of the product. Whereas before, I was really happy to, like, okay, I cut some parts and I basically start building a knife and like doing this handwork and just seeing like, oh, that's great. But if I want to design 5 things or I need to produce slightly more, the system starts to fall apart.
Mhm.
So for me, it's like, okay, strengthening the skills around my product design is that missing component. That's the
Right.
product that I'm missing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's where your product is lacking, and so
Right.
when someone comes to purchase, it's why you don't have enough of them.
Exactly.
You know it. And so another example that's, I think, dead on for this is like, so the Model T Ford, right, is looked at as like the product of the Industrial Revolution. Like, it's the most stereotypical Industrial
Right.
Revolution product. Henry Ford's product was not the Model T. Henry Ford's product was the assembly line.
Right.
The process is the product. If he
Yeah.
had
You
been
swap out
making,
the Model T for an airplane.
yep,
The
which they
assembly
did,
line, the assembly line
yeah,
is the critical component
yeah,
to
that's the
the
product.
end product.
So in World War II, the government got a hold of Ford and they said, "We need airplanes yesterday." Why did they come to him? Because he had the product that they wanted to buy, which is the assembly line. So it didn't matter if it was an airplane or a car. He was selling a product that was the assembly line, and it could be a plane, it could be a car, it could be a boat, it could be a truck, it could be a SUV, it could be, you know what I mean? So it's like
Yeah.
the assembly line is the product he created. And there's other people that were making cars before him, but they didn't have a product like he did. They didn't have that assembly line.
Right.
And so as a modern day, manufacturing guy, what I'm trying to do, obviously the assembly line's already been invented, but to be to have an advantage in this economy, I want to have a product like the assembly line, but in the 21st century. You know
Right.
what I mean? And so
As it
what is
relates to
that?
your product.
Yeah, what is that? And so
Well,
that's
and
like,
to
yeah.
like fire drill this, check this out. So we had a conversation a while back about production versus prototype mindset.
Mhm.
Okay. So say that, and this is actually pretty realistic. Say you are the embodiment of production mindset right now, and I am trying to embody prototype mindset.
Mhm.
This concept works equally well for both of us
Mhm.
because that process driven product for me looks different. But the steps to get there, like for me, okay, if I'm doing prototyping, my process to prototype a new product is more important than that end product
Yeah, exactly.
in the over a long timeline.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you're not just trying to do it once, you want to do this
Right.
for
I
a
don't want, yeah,
career.
I don't want to
Yeah.
design one thing and be done. So
Yeah.
let's frame this as it relates to us doing factory design. So a new maker comes to me and they're like, "Hey, how do I do well designing for a factory?" Right. The first thing I always tell them is be consistent.
Mhm.
So what is consistent? It might be 2 models a year, 5 models a year.
Mhm.
But over 10 years, if you hit those 2 to 5 models and those 2 to 5 models expand into SKUs because that's part of your process also. At the end of 10 years, it's just like any other type of investing, right?
Mhm.
Where we get real far into the weeds is that we have so many little things that we're trying to pay attention to from the standpoint of we're the manufacturer, we're the designer, we're the brand, we're the, like the
Mhm.
visual art, like there's so many components. This, I think, actually takes a lot of pressure and guesswork out of the overall kind of ecosystem of your business
Mhm.
because you
Yeah.
run each element through it and it gives you kind of a roadmap for like,
Mhm.
okay, it's not even about like, you'd be like the most arty artiste and still be able to run your process through this and be like, cool, I don't want any automation. I don't want any production. You're still probably wanting to produce yourself,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Man,
And it
there's so much meat
so
on it.
for your perspective, imagine if a company made a machine where you typed in, "This is my target audience, quick description, this is the blade length I'm looking for." If you could put in like 5 parameters and it would
Mm-hmm.
just print out a template of a knife that would fit those parameters and fit that target audience,
Right.
that machine would be a killer product, right?
Right.
Because CRKT would want one, Kershaw would
Sure.
want one, Benchmade would
Yep.
want one. That's your process. So
Right.
that's the product that you're selling them, is that you are that machine to
Right.
them, you know? And so it's not that the thing that gets printed out is the product, it's the machine that's the product. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And so
Man.
think
So
of
okay,
your
so
process like that machine. And the better it is, the
The
better you're
better it
doing.
is, right? And
Yeah.
it's this is all about for me. The biggest thing is the consistency. I see this as a method for looking at your own processes critically,
Mhm.
like not even like judgmentally, just being able to look at them and go, okay, what does this scale? If that's a critical component, is this
Mhm.
repeatable? Is this like, can I do this over a long timeline?
Mhm.
Um, and man, we spent so much time on it that it just like it keeps popping up
Mhm.
in everyday thought. And I'm like, huh, it doesn't matter if like thinking about it from a marketing standpoint, you're like, I I think people know this probably like I've taken a lot of inspiration from my business over like how streetwear has been handled, right? That's like
Mhm.
drop culture. That's a process.
Mhm.
The process of the drop is a product,
Yep.
right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's that product that has people showing up, because if the SciPop, if it didn't
Exactly.
have the product sphere around it of this
Right.
process, if it was just like if one just popped up on eBay and you had never existed and no
Right.
one knew what it was and there was
Right.
no draw and no one understood, yeah, people would buy it. They would think it was interesting, but it wouldn't have the traction because the product that precedes it, which is the whole sphere of influence, is it matters. It is a
Right.
product. Um,
I see a side effect of this that I don't know a way to prove this, but it's something that I feel I've seen over the years, which is if you have a successful, physical product or concept, like eventually it will be knocked off.
mhm,
Okay. Um, more visibility, more eyes, higher chance it gets knocked off.
mhm.
I think that the more the more flushed out your process is, the more engaged the audience is, the less of a risk that becomes.
And a perfect example, Chris Reeve Knives.
Yep.
They give shop tours. A lot of shops in their position would not.
Would not.
And the phrase that I've heard him say is, "We can show them how to do it, but they still have to do the work."
Still
You
have
know
to
what I
do the
mean?
work. Yep.
And
And
the
then
point
you don't get the story.
exactly. And the point being is, like, they know that the product is Chris Reeve Knives. Like, the product is this shop. The product are these people. The product is this brand.
Yep.
And just because you copy the knife doesn't mean you have their product, because
Right.
the product preceded the knife. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so they have a product, which is a brand, a business, a way of manufacturing things, a labor force, an institutional like tribal knowledge. All of this is the product.
Their relationships, their networks, these are all things that you can run through this same
Hmm.
filter, right? Like, hey, if I'm dealing with a business relationship, or I'm dealing with a new distributor or a customer, do you think a good relationship or like a negative relationship is going to play out better in the long
Right.
run?
Right.
Right?
Hmm.
It's a process.
And
So you have 30 years of relationships. That is a process. You're like, hey, we're honest and we work well with other businesses,
hmm
right?
yeah.
That plays.
And another kind of functional thing is, like, when I think about applying this and actually using it, executing on this thought, I kind of think back to that comb, and I think, okay, if I'm trying to start a business, a new one, or expand my current business, or do anything, the first thing I do is make a list mentally of the processes that are available to me, and just like with the comb, what is the purchaser, what is a customer going to buy that is going to serve them, that this process that I have can create. And
Right.
it's like, I think some people, they get, I know, I understand the like addiction and drive to make a knife, but I would caution some people and say, if you don't have the processes yet to be able to pull it off, do something that your processes already lend themselves to,
Right.
because that's the product you have to sell. You don't If you don't have the ability to do this high level thing, like, let's say, a folding Damascus, all this other stuff, you have to sell the product that you have. and you can go crazy, but you're from a business standpoint, you're going to do best selling the process that you have, right? And
Even
so,
if it's not from business, I think from a development
yeah,
standpoint, you have the ability to cross the divide in, like, say, from making, or like my situation right now is I would like to go into Fusion and I would like to design my next folder. The
mhm,
problem is I'm not fluid enough with Fusion, but I can go in and I can design a pry
mhm,
bar. I
mhm,
am much better off designing a pry bar, modeling it, and running the cam, fixturing, and running it on my machine than I am spending 3 months trying to develop a folder as the first product that I release.
right,
This is a scalable concept, right? Which is
mhm,
like, do the work available to you
yeah,
and use that as an evolutionary,
yep,
like, process, as opposed to like a revolutionary
yeah,
process.
yeah. Sell the process that you have, and then acquire more processes.
Right.
And a lot of people go the other way around. And
Right.
that's, I think, the stumbling block is like sell the pro. And for an example, for me, like I said, I sold the comb. I eventually could afford a CNC. I added that. Now I can sell a knife.
Right.
But I haven't started selling folders because I don't feel like I own the process that's saleable to be selling folders.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's like I have to own the process first. You can't sell the product and back into the process. Like you can, but
You can't.
it's not the best way to do it, in my opinion. Is the gist?
That's the thing that's crazy, I think, about small scale businesses in general, is that I always joke, I'm like, I'm really lucky that I started when I did and I didn't know any better, because I just did it.
Hmm.
I didn't know that you couldn't make any money, and I didn't know that I didn't have the right tools. I didn't know that I didn't have enough skills. I didn't know that nobody was going to want it. I didn't know any of those things. So I
Hmm.
just did it.
Hmm.
And I think that, like, there's so many areas where you can do this, and like a lot of times it works out. Where I think you and I are both at is we're starting to see some things that essentially can shorten the curve,
Yeah.
which is pretty cool.
There's the brute force way to do it, and then there's
Yeah.
the like kind of intellectual way to do it. And the brute force way would be like, okay, the first product you want to bring to market is a titanium frame lock with a lock bar insert with Sanmai Damascus made in house. And so the amount of processes you have to develop to get it to market is enormous right out the gate. And it's like you probably end up in a lot of debt because you have to buy a bunch of machines. You know what I mean? Like and then you can, at the end of the day, maybe everyone wants the knife and you sell it and then you pay off all the debt and then you're afloat, you're going, you're moving.
Right.
But if you had started with the processes you have, maybe all it is CAD. That's a product. Like that's I lived off that for a long time, selling my CAD ability as a product.
Right.
And maybe that's the only thing you've got until you can add one more layer. And then you have another product to sell, another layer, another product to sell, and eventually what the customer is buying is going to materialize into a more and more complex purchase, right?
Right. And they're going to evolve. They're going to evolve with your
yeah,
pricing, your product. You
yeah.
you and I also share something, I think, inside of the industry, which is, overall, the knife industry is, I believe, still a hobby led industry.
Hmm.
Okay. When I started, I didn't start it as a hobby. I started it because I was looking for a way to build a career
Hmm.
around something that I enjoyed doing. I think the same is true for you.
Hmm.
Right. So I think some of this stuff is, if you're a hobbyist and you just want to, like, go to the shop and mess around, there's a point where, yeah, this may not be important.
Hmm.
But as far as like developing a business around a craft or a product, I think it's pretty handy.
Yeah. 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 I just, I love business and I love manufacturing and I love making things. And I would still be, if I was working for a company that didn't like a normal day job and I wasn't making anything, I would still be doing this on the side in some capacity,
Yeah.
albeit in a smaller scale.
Right.
But for me, the combination, like the marriage of business and craftsmanship and having them work together is awesome. And like they need each other. You know what I mean? That's like how I
Totally.
see it. And so, because like for example, if you think of a amazing knife or whatever it is you're trying to sell, and you do it like I mentioned, where you don't really have the business concept in mind, but you're just gonna like moonshot. You're just gonna head for this advanced product right out the gate. Like, if it results in you not being in business anymore, then the vision of that product may have been the guiding light, but if you end up not making any knives because of this wrong approach, then you're behind the vision of making things at all. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's like you're better off making something that you can make in a business viable way than to make something not business viable temporarily and then fail.
Right.
If a maker is what you really want to be, you
Right.
know?
Yeah. Some of this too is secure. Yeah, I guess it's security of the long term as it relates to you staying involved. A
Mhm.
weird area where I feel like I've seen this inside the knife industry is at like in Atlanta. Over the years, I've seen probably 3 or 4 times a table with someone behind it with a very cool mechanism. But the product that it is in is so rough and unrefined that the mechanism is like almost invisible to me.
Mhm. Yeah,
That is like a prime example of
it
like
is.
the concept, and you're like, I'm going to take this concept and I'm going to build a finished product, except you actually don't have the skill set or the resources to build the finished product,
Mhm.
and then you take it to a trade show.
Right. And
I
if
would love, I'm sure somebody will have a case study where they can prove me wrong on this. Like, obviously, people do this. Like, you can go and spend your 10 years and be an overnight success. But I'm just saying, like, kind of base level standard, you are the rule and not the exception.
Mhm.
I think this plays in a
Yeah.
pretty big way.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And like if you the other thing here is like if you wanted to hire someone to make it, like
Yes.
a Wee knife or a Riot or a Millet or a whoever, if you were going to hire someone to make it, you're buying their product, right? And this is another layer I want to bring into this that I haven't brought up to you, but I'm still working on it, but we can work on it together, I guess. Any business 101 course is going to tell you for a business, you need a product and you need a way to sell it. That's like just generic rule number one of starting a business, right? You got to have both. So we've decided in this, recently that the product that you're trying to sell is your process. Okay. And then now we're talking about, you mentioned earlier, a way to sell it, right? I would almost argue that the design of the whatever it is, whether it's a mechanism or a shape or a color or a whatever, that's a way to sell it. And so you have the two spheres of the product, which is the process, and then you have the sphere of a way to sell it. So if you look at a Wee knife or a Riot, they have the product, which is the process, but the design is open ended, and so they often have designers or companies purchasing that are that are trying to get OEM work. They're the ones coming up with a way to sell it, and the design is in that sphere.
Right.
Does that make sense? And so
Fully.
and that's where I look at it of like when I get my product finished, I haven't even started designing yet. So my
Right.
product is finished when my process is finished. And then I start thinking about a way to sell it. And if I think about, is it a knife? Is it a pry bar? Is it a digging tool? Is it what is it? You know what I mean? Like that part is the a way to sell it category. And so if you look at your relationship as a designer with like Sierra KT, they have the process and the product.
Right.
Even if it doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have a color, a
Right.
texture, they don't know what it
Right.
is,
We
but
feed in our concept, our visuals
yeah.
into their machine that takes the design,
Mhm.
runs it through production, runs it through the way that they are handling their sales and marketing
Mhm.
to the end
Yeah.
consumer.
So we are helping them in the a way to sell it category. And if you look at someone like Benchmade, for example, they have a product, which is their process, right? Which involves the axis lock heavily, that is so strong in selling itself because it's American made that they have a very low requirement on this on the design side, so they don't really work with a whole lot of designers on the outside
All internal.
because
Well, not all, but
they're a way to sell it category. They don't. It's not as it doesn't need to be as robust because the product sells itself so well.
right.
And so, you know what I mean? Like different companies have different weights on the process and a way to sell it category and different balances. And that's where I think about that. And I'm like, you can have a product without having ever designed anything is the overall gist.
Fully. Interesting. Okay. So here's a question. Is this concept much more important when you are in a growth phase, or does it still hold if you are in like steady holding pattern? You are making a product that is the same product. You are not actively trying to develop or, I guess, like branch out from it.
So you're Apple. No, I'm just kidding.
Apple's. Well, yeah. As I'm saying it, I'm trying to like think of like who would fit into that. Like the ideal, it would be like a single product where the only product you are making, you're like, okay, this is it. This is what we do.
Mm-hmm.
This is the product. So I don't know who that is.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably manufacturers that make like wood screws and fasteners that haven't changed it in 30 years.
Right.
And they just
is this relevant to them? It probably becomes very like macro.
Well, their process of making those, like let's say it is fittings, brass fittings for plumbing, and they're not changing because it's a standard thing. Their process is the product,
right?
In that the process is the forging and the machining and the fitment of these fittings, and the fittings are ancillary to the product. And yeah, I mean, I think it applies, right? I mean, because what they're selling is if someone were to devise or need something different that uses the same process, they would do that as well, which they probably do.
Man, I'll tell you, you kind of called it out when you mentioned like the OEM manufacturers. This is super relevant to them. Like if someone came to me and was like, "Hey, make this knife," it would be the most inefficient project, right? Like I would make a knife the way I make a knife. You would be a drastic step up, right? Be like, okay, cool. It's a fixed blade. I have this process. I can do this thing. It's scalable. So when I've had employees in the past, this is small job shop that relies heavily on hand skills. So I'm having to teach how to see and how to actually accomplish whatever technique we're trying to do. Whereas in a more uniform process, the jobs become, it's a more kind of definable task. You're like, oh, stone this blade.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And here's another thing. I think maybe we're leaning towards describing this as a business and like scalability proposition. Yeah. But on the other hand, let's say you're like a Kyle Royer who makes unbelievable knives. Like we're talking the opposite of efficiency. We're talking one absolutely mind-blowing, crazy design, custom Damascus.
Right. As much time as you can spend.
Yeah. Peak man hours in a knife that you'll probably see. The product is still his process because a customer is buying his hours. They're buying his time and his knowledge and his know-how in the form of a knife. Right. So they're buying a piece of him, right? And so if you're trying to sell something, a product that is your process, some customers want to buy a piece of you and your handwork and your man hours, and that's what they're interested in, and that product is of value to them. But if you're someone who's going to buy like a Benchmade, you want a functional product that's efficient. So you're going to buy a process that lends itself to what you're looking for. You know what I mean? So I would argue that the process being the product, it doesn't break down when you go into craftsmanship.
Right.
Because the customer is looking for that product. If that knife that Kyle Royer made was made fully automated, those customers would probably be less interested in it because it's not the same product they're looking for. Even if it's the same knife.
I totally agree. I think we're getting way off into the weeds on this one, which is great. Right. Okay, so to balance that one, if we use we.
Mhm.
I think there's been a huge shift in the industry, which is, I think at this point, people, the way or we's process in relation to the quality of product they produce has opened up an entire sphere of collector that is like, oh, we really do care about the quality and the presentation. The manufacturing is transparent. People know where it's made. And I think 15 years ago, it wouldn't have been the same way. So I think the
Mhm.
process of releasing the product, showing how high quality they are, working with designers, that process that they kind of like, they didn't originate it, right? Like that's
Mhm.
not, but they started to open some doors.
Yeah.
There's been a cultural shift. So you're like, all
Yeah.
of a sudden there's actually like a new process product, like
L
sphere.
it's like the product being the process being the product was always there, but
Right.
it's only recently that companies have been illuminating that fact
Right.
to the customer
Right.
in a sense, you know?
Yeah. Well, I don't know why. Recently, I was thinking about Albion Armory. Do you know who they are? Do you know the
Mm-mm.
name? Okay,
Mm-mm.
so like basically, have you seen Conan,
Conan?
the Conan the Barbarian?
The new one? No. Or the old
No,
one?
the old one,
Uh,
1982. Okay,
Schwarzenegger.
Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
Okay, Sword of the Father.
Yeah.
Okay, that is Jody Sampson and basically Albion Armory. So it's like they were doing movie pieces, and like I don't know all the details to this, but essentially that was a small shop with multiple people working. I believe under Jody Sampson
Mhm.
producing product. Did I think so? This is that idea of like the say the higher art or like guys who are swordsmiths and doing this stuff. And I think in that time period, I think Albion did the same thing, which was they were producing the quality, but they were producing numbers. And I think people were like, oh, this is amazing.
Mhm.
Right. So in that concept of like, oh, it's sole source made by a person, the next step is like, oh, this is really cool. It's made by multiple people, but the end product is amazing. I think as craftsmen, it can be really easy to worry about how you make things. What we think, like what I think of as making a knife, how I think of it making. And I think it's good to kind of reevaluate that throughout your career.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it's really easy to become super judgmental of
Mhm.
new trends in an industry, new techniques, new tools,
Mhm.
processes, just in
Yeah.
general, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's important to remember what is your product that you're selling. And that is what is your process, because it can change over time and it can get away from you if you're only worried about what the physical object you're putting in your customer's hand is not the only product. You know what I
Putting the
mean?
wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable.
Am I?
No,
Oh.
but in general,
Oh, I
if
see what
you're
you're
only
saying.
looking,
I see what you're saying. I was like, "Wait, what did I mispronounce?"
no, if
Yeah.
you're only looking at the product and being like, this is rad,
Cuz if that's all you're doing,
right?
then why isn't we making almost every knife? You know what I
Right.
mean? Cuz like
Here's a weird question for you. How many times in this episode do you think we've said the process is the
oh,
product?
I don't know. It's a good question. It could be a drinking game. I mean,
Oh, man.
that's true. But if you had, let's say, we or Riot make your customs and you sold them as customs,
Right.
there'd be a little bit of an issue there, right?
Right.
It would be, because that's not what people are trying to buy.
Right.
But it's proof that the knife isn't the only thing they're buying.
No.
You know what I mean? Because if they made the exact same knife, people wouldn't want it in the way that they want your custom,
Well,
because it's not
we
the
actually
same
have
thing.
historical context
Yeah.
for just this,
Mhm.
which was 15 years ago, as some of the Asian manufacturers were starting to be accessible by US makers. There were makers, and even more recent, that went to China, had a knife produced, and either presented it as a custom or had parts produced and then assembled and presented it as customs. And I think that that is a big part of why initially people frowned on overseas manufacturing inside of the knife market. Whereas as soon as it became transparent, all of a sudden you're just like, oh, it's just actually a rad shop doing really good work.
Yeah.
Because you understand and are able to make a judgment based on the actual information.
Yep. They know what process they're buying.
Right.
That's what.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next 5 to 10 years. Like I see more and more, collections that are built completely out of really high-end overseas knives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love it. I think it's great. I think it's good competition. I think it keeps people honest. Conversations about like US manufacturing aside, for me, I look at the knife industry and I just think like, man, the way that it's expanded and has become more inclusive is nothing but good.
Yeah.
No, more competitive, sure. Sometimes kind of scary, but like that I think is good. And I think it keeps us honest too, which is like, you can't just like sit back and be like, oh yeah, I'm good. Like, and you have to reevaluate.
And another point is like each form of knife, each business model, each strategy, each country of origin fits a niche. It fits a reason, a direction, a customer, a purpose. You know what I mean? And so part of it is like figuring out where you're at and what to lean into. You know what I mean? It's like, what are the if you're trying to make American made knives, lean into the strengths of American made knives. If you're trying to get an overseas OEM, lean into those strengths. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Be able to explain it.
Yeah. And so there's some ways of organizing things. Like, for example, right now, like I think, again, I'll say it, the product being the process is almost the most true right now for American made knives because people are so interested in buying American made. And in reality, there's just not that many of them, that strictly the fact that the process is American makes people want to buy that product. You know what I mean? And so it's like there's a selling point that comes all the way from the process side of things. And it's the same case for we or Riot or any other company that makes these high-end knives. Like they drive sales because of their process, right?
Right.
And so, but American made is also a driver. You know what I mean? So it's like having your process drive sales is what my business model is. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's kind of the gist of the whole conversation in a sense. And so, transparency is what you need. Transparency to have that, people need to know what they're looking at. How are you making it?
It's pretty fun, man. This one, it feels like it's really easy just to kind of like roll on and on about it. But in the context of us hanging out in Salt Lake, you have conversations like this where something like a missing piece is put into place or something is illuminated. Who knows? Maybe 5 people. Do we have 5 people listening to the podcast yet? Maybe one person,
right?
maybe 2 people hear this and they actually click with the concept and they're able to frame it in what they're doing. I never know, but it's like, we'll have these conversations and I'm like, damn, how have I made it 20 years without like seeing that same exact feeling that I had around maker versus manager, or it's like a light bulb goes off.
Or I wonder, like, is the way I'm looking at it totally wrong? And somebody's listening that can correct that.
Totally. Well, and some of this is probably relative. I would say that it's not wrong for where we're at now. Right? Could it be wrong in 10 years? I think we're going to probably see, hopefully.
Yeah. Let me say this. We talked before the podcast. I did have one thought about looking at your product and your process this way. And one possible weakness or blind side or failing of this, if you are overly subscribed to this idea, is that if you have a process, let's say you own injection molding equipment and you just want to make a lot of injection molded parts, it's easy to make things that the world doesn't need, even though they sell. And so in the effort to sell your process, to sell my process, I want to make sure that I'm still selling things that people that improve the world, that actually are they, not just because they sell, they actually improve the world and they're better. And I'm not selling things that people don't need that are irrelevant. You know what I mean? And so it's like that's where I think you can get, if you get overly like, if you're a massive corporation and you have a process that you're trying to sell, if all you're trying to do is sell that process, you can end up flooding markets with things that aren't of real value. They're like either
Right.
disposable or just kind of
Value
like,
is subjective. This is
yeah,
tricky because, like,
yeah,
you look at a knife and you're like, at the point that we're selling knives, nobody needs the product,
hmm,
right? It's essentially at any level of custom or high end manufacturing, it is a luxury.
hmm,
Um, and I think that's also a really good thing for us to look at,
hmm,
as kind of just something to to internalize. For me, it creates gratitude because I realize, like, hey, it happens to be that I like to make this
hmm,
thing.
hmm,
I'm very fortunate that there is an audience that appreciates this thing,
yeah,
even though it's not a loaf of bread,
right, right,
right? Like,
hmm,
I'm
yeah,
sure I'm sure it falls apart. I'm sure there's areas where this kind of falls apart. Um, anytime I hear an argument, I try and not be instantly combative to it.
hmm.
So I try to look at it and figure out like what is right with the argument, um, before I try to shut it down.
So an example, I guess, of an unethical way to use the process as a product mentality is like corn is a process that's really expandable, like growing corn.
Okay.
And so then conglomerations or Monsanto or whoever you want to talk about, they're trying to figure out ways to sell corn because that's the process they have,
Right.
just like I talked, which is good business sound strategy.
Sure.
So then we end up with like high fructose corn syrup in everything.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about. Of like you can force something into selling, even though that process shouldn't be sold in that way.
Oh,
But
we're getting really deep now.
yeah, but I'm just
I
trying to
get. I
say like
fully. No, I know. I
you
fully get it.
you can have an ethics blind spot if all you're trying to do is sell your process and you don't care about what the product is. You
Right.
know what I mean? So you still have to care about what the product is.
Right. Well, okay. We can also look at this from process of the product. Every time I sell a poly, I put it in a plastic bag. Okay. I- I'm trying to do that less. So I'm
Hmm,
looking for packaging that doesn't just involve me putting product in a plastic bag. So
hmm,
this is twofold, right? I'm selling enough of them that I realize that just more like plastic trash is actually not something I want to do.
hmm,
Okay. It also doesn't represent the product. It's from a time period where that was kind of the resource that I had. And that was the way a lot of product was kind of sold. Like you put it in the plastic bag and you put
hmm,
the product card in it and you take it to the show.
hmm,
I have to look at that now through this lens of the process being the end product and being like, okay, how can I improve that?
hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
it plays. This is an expandable concept that you can get pretty abstract with.
Hmm,
I'm sure it relates to a lot of facets of life. um like, look at your diet. What you put in your body is like what you get out. It's like a simple concept, right? I
hmm,
think for me, sometimes simple concepts reframed feel like very revolutionary, and you know they probably are in that context because it
hmm,
sometimes reframing it is what allows you to see the value in something.
hmm. Yeah.
Process of the product.
Yeah.
I want that on auto tune
Right.
and a
Dude,
t-shirt.
so we do a remix of this.
Yeah.
Just
So
just
I don't
sample the
know.
whole thing.
I don't know. I feel like we have made our argument, or at least an explanation of something that we spent probably way too much time talking about, like a couple of schoolgirls at 1:00 in the morning.
Yeah. Right.
Here's, I wanted to touch on something else, that these conversations, they're so fun, like, to have on the pod, equally satisfying when you're like having dinner and, walking around a knife show. We did something super fun at Blade that I think I wanted to touch on, which is the idea of we both looked at each other's process and tried to find a hole in it.
Mhm.
Right. So I think for me, you had said where with what I'm doing, the way that I'm running my business, you saw kind of a weakness was my inability to, how did you phrase it? Do you remember?
I think it was basically like you have so much on your plate that you are divvying up like almost on a weekly basis the allocation of time to deal with those things.
Right.
But I think some of those things require a longer stint of time for it to be effective. Like maybe
Right.
set a whole month aside for one thing
Right.
rather than like 1 hour a day on that
So it's
thing.
like, right. So I'm trying to like pick it, what I forget what the analogy is of like an elephant, but essentially like I'm trying to like pick at something huge in an hour a day, and it's not working. So my agreement on that was essentially, after I do the Kentucky Knife Show, I'm basically going to dedicate all of December to like a deep dive on fusion and developing a new model based around a lot of the things that kind of you and I have been working on, and like the skills that you've been helping me improve.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I had for you was essentially that I wanted, like, I think you could have like some more diversification of passive income product.
Yeah.
Right.
Like,
Because right now you're primarily sole product output.
Like, to kind of do a callback, like to do more of the how to sell it sphere.
Right.
Which is things like working more with CRKT, working with expanding.
Well, in that component, you actually really have, right? You have the design component, which essentially is passive income.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have passive product in your own line.
Yeah.
At this point.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? It looks like either an OEM project or starting to do a little bit more merch, or it was just, just kind of an overview. What I loved about that is it's actually kind of scary to ask someone to be like, hey, where do you see a weakness?
What are my flaws as a business
what are the
owner?
flaws? Has to be a high level of trust, but I would highly recommend that if you're listening to this and you're a maker and you have a good maker friend, play the game. It's pretty fun.
I think the reason we did that is we were talking, we would go to we were rooming together at Blade Show West, and we're always thinking about like all these brands, and we're like, if this brand just had this, they would be so successful. And if this brand was just one thing, just did this,
nailing it here, missing it here.
We're sitting there realizing like we haven't told that to each other. And so it's like, you know what I mean? We should look at each other and say, what if your brand just had this?
Right.
And it's like, that's a really easy thing. I like hearing that. It's palatable, but no one asks, right? And so it's like, we both, I think, walked away thinking like, we should ask everybody we trust, what's that little thing that you can just look right at my business and I trust you to tell me what you can probably see something I can't. What is it?
Yeah. And are you instantly like defensive to that response?
Right. Yeah.
Does it sting a little bit? Like, it's not all going to be relevant, right? Because we have different like goals, different desires, all that stuff. But I just think as a kind of a thought exercise, it's just a really fun process to do, look at something from outside of like your own vacuum.
Yeah.
So that's all I got, man. I'm really glad we're back recording a little bit. This was fun.
Well, I hope this one was a zinger. This is a topic I really was excited about. So hopefully we made people happy if they were waiting, on the edge of their chair for this release, and hopefully it met expectations. So
I would love if you guys got questions on this or thoughts, or want to poke holes in the kind of concept. Please do. This is
if the process is not
dialogue.
the product, fight me. No. Yeah.
Man, cool. Thanks for listening, guys. Please leave us a review, share the pod, and we will talk at you soon.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Have a
All
good
right.
one.